Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Section 3, the New American Diplomacy. And we're going to get into talking a little bit about the rise of our nation, at least as an imperialistic power. But in 1899, the United States was becoming a major naval power. We had just finished the Spanish-American War, and when this all ends, we kind of take a look at things, and the United States at that time had the third largest navy in the world. And certainly that becomes important because of the fact that we're so interested in developing business opportunities with our neighbors. So, in our first main idea, the nation's primary interest in Asia was not conquest but commerce, which is a kind of a fancy name for business. And so, in number one, the vast Chinese markets excited American business leaders, especially those in textile, oil, and steel industries. One of the things that had happened in the course of the late 1890s and the beginning of 1900 is that America really started doing more trade with China. And in a 5-year period, our trade had increased about 4 times. Even though China only bought about 2% of our foreign exports or American exports, we saw great opportunities here in a market that could be easily cultivated to help our economy. But we weren't the only ones. So in 1894, there was a war between China and Japan over Korea. Korea had always been kind of a territory that the Japanese and the Chinese kind of fought over. But in this war, the Japanese easily won. They had certainly industrialized themselves and became a force to be reckoned with in the Far East. And as a result of this war, not only did the Japanese gain Korea, but they also gained a territory called Manchuria, which is in northeastern China. As quickly as they got it, others were jealous, and the Russians quickly said that this was not fair, and they forced Japan to give back this newly acquired territory to China. And as soon as the Japanese do so, the Russians promptly demand that China give this territory to them. And not only do the Russians, but the Germans, the French, the British, they're all demanding to have this thing called a leasehold, this idea that they get a little stake of the territory here. And what ends up happening is we start talking about this thing called a sphere of influence. It's an area where a foreign country controls economic development and resources. And what was very frightening for at least the United States is that there was a great fear that these foreign nations were going to partition, meaning that they were going to break up China into these different territories. So the United States proposed something called an open door policy. This was something proposed by our Secretary of State, John Hay, and our President, President McKinley, which would allow all countries to trade with China. And what Hayes asked for was that all these other nations that had the leaseholds just participate in this, that we'd all recognize each other's trading rights. We wouldn't divide up China into different countries, and we would all try to get along. And that was great. We made it work. But literally, as soon as we made that agreement, there is going to be rebellion in China. And there is an event known as the Boxer Rebellion that takes place in 1900. The Harmonious Fist, or basically a group of nationalists from China, they set out to kind of get rid of the foreigners. They called us the foreign devils. They were also wanting to get rid of Chinese Christian converts, and the Chinese military supported this group. At some point, about 200 foreigners were killed. Many were taken prisoner. But the event that really kind of broke the straw or the camel's back, I guess the straw that broke the camel's back, was a German ambassador was killed. And the Germans, the Austrian Hungarians, the British, the French, the Italians, the Japanese, the Russians, and us all decided that we needed to intervene. And we sent about 50,000 international troops, about 3,400 of them being American, to China and to kind of regain control in that country. And they eventually were able to do that, and they were able to kind of open these markets back up. Uh, Along with that, we also have to talk about some changes here in the United States. Um, William McKinley eventually is going to be assassinated, but in 1900, it was an election year, and McKinley had a vice president that had died, I think, in 1899. And so he never replaced that vice president. So as he's going into the election year, he's got to select a running mate. And as a result of that, Theodore Roosevelt is going to be selected as the running mate, vice presidential candidate. McKinley probably chose Roosevelt because, number one, he was a war hero, he was young. All those things might have been appealing to voters. And as a result, they were able to defeat William Jennings Bryan very easily. Um, about a year later, or a few months later, in September of 1901, McKinley went to the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. It was kind of like a World's Fair, if you want to call it that. All the great innovations, all these wonderful foreign exhibits were going to be there. And McKinley was going to give a speech, which he did. But he also did a meet and greet where he would shake hands and meet the people who wanted to stand in line and just quickly shake his hand. And that day, a guy who was a Polish anarchist, Leon Czergozi, was standing in line, and he shot McKinley. Just so you know, Czergozi was, for the most part, a anarchist who had worked in the steel industry and he got himself blacklisted and for the most part couldn't find work after that. And he was really distraught, and he kind of decided he was going to take it out on the president. So he shoots the president, and the president does not die immediately. Matter of fact, Roosevelt was going to go and check up on the president in Buffalo, and he's told to just kind of stay away. It's no big deal. And what ends up happening is McKinley takes a turn for the worst and dies of an infection just a handful of days later. Leon, on the other hand, he is obviously arrested, and he will be executed for his crime. But needless to say, our Theodore Roosevelt is going to be our new president, and he is the youngest president in American history. Only 42 at the time that he becomes the commander-in-chief, and he's got a lot of ideas. This is a guy who is really gung-ho about making a difference here. And where does he want to make a difference? Right here in the Western Hemisphere. So at number 5, Roosevelt and others viewed construction of a canal through Central America as vital to our American power in the world. We needed to move our Navy around, and so having a canal would certainly speed that along, and we had ships that we had goods that we wanted to trade. So yeah, we needed a canal. And in 1903, the United States was almost right there, ready to get this to happen. We had signed a handful of little treaties kind of leading up to this that gave us exclusive rights to build this canal in Central America. The only thing we needed was Colombia to say yes and to, agree to the deal, but they didn't. And as a result of that, we were kind of like back at square one. What we did instead is we helped a group of Panamanians who were wanting their independence stage a little war of independence. So in November of 1903, we helped recognize the independence of Panama, but we did so with a little bit of muscle. We'd actually taken about 10 of our warships down to Panama, and when this little revolution was going on, we were kind of giving them some moral support, if you want to call it that. But anyway, as a result of that, we're going to be able to build this canal. But before we build that, we got to make sure that we're not going to have too many conflicts with our European powers. So President Roosevelt proposes something known as the Roosevelt Quarterly. This is an addition to the Monroe Doctrine that goes back to James Monroe, roughly the 1820s, 1830s. The deal is the Monroe Doctrine pretty much said that the United States had the right to kind of intervene with the business of a lot of Western Hemisphere nations. What the corollary basically says is that, yes, we would have the right to intervene in Latin America or the Western Hemisphere affairs when necessary to maintain economic and political stability. So if it's going to hurt our wallet, we can be involved. If it's going to hurt politics in general, we have a right to be involved. And we're going to take this to heart. Well, through the end of the 20th century, we're going to be kind of going back to this corollary. So the United States first applies the Roosevelt corollary to the Dominican Republic. And part of that was the Dominican Republic had fallen behind on some debt payments. And at that time, what would happen is those European nations would come and basically seize control until they got their money. And what we did is we decided that we would take responsibility for collecting their debts. And so what we did is we sent U.S. Marines to the Dominican Republic, and they would start collecting the custom tariffs from different ships that were coming and going. And this way, the people of the Dominican Republic could get their debts paid back to those European powers. Sounds like a great plan. So our last main idea, we're going to talk a little bit about President Wilson. We're going to kind of skip the Taft years. We'll come back and talk about him later, but we want to talk a little bit about what was happening in Mexico. And before Wilson becomes president in 1913, got to go back to maybe about 1910 or a little bit before. Mexico had a ruler who was a dictator. His name was Diaz. And Diaz, love him or hate him, he was a guy who brought basically industrialization to Mexico. But the problem is he was allowing a lot of foreigners to come in and take ownership and make investments in Mexico. And so some of that money was not staying in Mexico. And what you were seeing is a great divide between the rich and the poor. And Diaz kind of siding with the rich. In 1911, some of these people who were upset by this economic division in Mexico staged a revolution. And they brought a man named Francisco Madero to power. He, for the most part, probably had a good heart. I mean, I think he meant well, but he wasn't really a really good administrator. And he also made some promises about land reform that kind of sounded a little bit socialistic, where you would take land from the rich to give to the poor. And obviously, if you were one of the wealthier people, you probably hated that idea. So in 1913, a guy named General Huerta comes to power kind of in a coup. And he seized power, and immediately they murder Madero, who was the former leader. The United States basically likened Huerta as a brute. And shortly after Wilson takes office, Huerta seized power in Mexico. And for the most part, the United States was on the defensive. We were upset with what was going on, and we wanted to stop him. So in an effort to kind of stop that, we do send some troops down into Mexico. And in April of 1914, American soldiers, sailors primarily, were arrested. Were arrested in Mexico. The arrested should be your blank there. And what ends up happening is that Mexico refused to apologize. These men were eventually released. But we saw it as a great opportunity to overthrow Huerta. And as a result, we get permission, or President Wilson gets permission from Congress to send troops into Mexico. And we send Marines down to the city of Veracruz, which is along the Gulf of Mexico. And the goal is to stop foreign arms shipments that were coming from Germany to Mexico to help Huerta. And we ended up shelling the city of Veracruz. There were some Mexicans that were really upset by that. And eventually we're going to start seeing anti-American protests throughout the country of Mexico, especially along our U.S. border. And that leads us to this guy named Pancho Villa. In March of 1916, some of his followers slip into the United States, crossing the border in New Mexico to this little town of Columbus, New Mexico. Not a very, very big community, probably less than 10,000 people. And they ended up killing 16 Americans before they slipped back across the border. This little rebellion was to kind of, tell Americans to stay out of Mexico. And as a result of that, President Wilson sends a guy named John J. Pershing, or General J.J. Pershing, into Mexico to capture Pancho Villa. Pershing had basically been an educator for a while. He had actually been the professor of military science at the University of Nebraska Lincoln. And if you go down to the campus in Lincoln, you're going to find that there are a lot of things that are named after this man. The old Pershing Auditorium in Lincoln was named for J.J. Pershing. So this is a guy who's got roots in the city of Lincoln, and he's still kind of beloved today. When we look at like Memorial Stadium, there's a little nod of the hat to him in a sense. But him and his troops go into Mexico and they start a wild goose chase looking for Pancho Villa. 6,000 American troops go looking for him and they can't find him anywhere. In a way, Pancho Villa was kind of like Osama bin Laden. We just couldn't find him. We couldn't figure out where he had went. Eventually, in 1917, President Wilson recalls J.J. Pershing and his troops because we're right on the verge of going to war in Europe for the First World War. And so we never find Villa, but eventually Villa is killed, and that all kind of gets rectified, I guess. But needless to say, Mexico was not an easy fight by any means. In number 12, in 1914, Wilson negotiated exclusive rights for bases, naval bases, and another canal in the country of Nicaragua. We had originally thought that might be a place to build, and unfortunately, we never built there, but there's reasons for that. The elevation in Nicaragua is obviously much higher than what it is in Panama. Needless to say, 1915, we send Marines back into parts of the Caribbean. We send them to Haiti to put down a rebellion, and those troops stay until the middle of the 1930s. We also send troops in 1916 to Dominican Republic to kind of preserve order. Thank you very much.